Let's bring in MS Now's Vaughn Hilliard from the White House. MS Now's Inés de la Cuetara live from Davos. And MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde. Also with us, author of the Need to Know Substack and Daily Beast columnist David Rothkopf. Vaughn, President Trump really creating quite a stir and making some news there. Talk to us about how he tried to make the case for the U.S. to acquire Greenland.
Right, Anna. I think that we need to be very clear at this moment in time what the backdrop was to these remarks from the President of the United States in Switzerland. And that was that less than 24 hours ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, effectively speaking for a great number of European countries, was very explicit about the threat that the United States president was posing to European countries. He said yesterday, we're shifting to a world without rules. Imperial ambitions are resurfacing, in which unacceptable tariffs are being used as leverage against territorial sovereignty, and that Trump wants to openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe. That comes just days after President Trump threatened to impose new tariffs on each of those countries, including Europe and Denmark, I should say France and Denmark, unless they push for Denmark to agree to the selling of Greenland to the United States. And so while it is notable that President Trump there in Davos said that he does not intend to use force, he also made it very clear that it would be overwhelming force and that the U.S. could easily take it and that there would be little resistance. It was that sort of a threat that, of course, European allies, longtime European allies of the United States, are clearly in tune to, because President Trump has made his objective very clear. He has continued to post also about acquiring Canada. He has called himself the acting president of Venezuela. So his expansionist ideations have been made very clear to Europe. And the president of the United States made it clear that he and the United States effectively are boosting the economies of these European countries, and that if they were to forego cooperating with the United States, their economies would consequently suffer.
Inez, I'm curious if there's any international response so far to the Trump's remarks. I know it's early, but what is the tone? What are you hearing?
Yeah, and I will wait to get specific statements from different countries. But I think overall there's a sense that the president's arguments are not holding up here. So he continues to insist that he needs Greenland for national security reasons. And yet it was just last week that the Danes and European allies announced they would be sending in reinforcements to Greenland, additional troops, additional resources to bolster security both in Greenland and around the Arctic. And the president's response was to threaten to slap 10% tariffs on those countries. So I think people don't understand what he's trying to do. Beyond that, you know, Anna, I was just in Greenland last week. We were talking about this. I repeatedly spoke to Greenlandic officials who told me there is no evidence of an immediate Russian threat from Russia or China, telling me that they had not seen evidence of Russian and Chinese ships in Greenlandic waters, as the president has claimed. I even spoke to a Danish naval officer who told me that in his 30-plus years of working in and around Greenland, he had never seen a Chinese or a Russian ship. So I think there's confusion in terms of what the president's argument is here. People just don't understand what he's trying to do. And one more point I'll make, just coming back from my trip from Greenland, speaking to people there, when you hear the president talking about how Greenland is just a piece of ice, that is something that's going to be deeply offensive to people there. Greenland is home to Greenlanders who are, the population there is a vast majority of them are Inuit. They are very proud. They have a very rich history and culture. It is much more than just a piece of ice to them. So that's something to watch, as well as the reaction coming from Greenlanders, Anna.
Yeah, Vaughn, you touched on some of the remarks we heard from world leaders ahead of the president's speech. In fact, it was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney who got a standing ovation when he talked about a rupture, not a transition underway, and also went on to say that there's a strong tendency for countries to sort of just go along, that it's the easier route to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety, he said. It won't. French President Macron also criticizing the president's take on Greenland and handling of allies. And the president called them out in his speech. What did he say directly about Mark Carney and Macron?
Right, Anna. Over the course of the last year, since the president's inauguration, we have seen a posture of appeasement by European countries largely towards President Trump. There have been agreements of trade deals that have been announced in order to try to bring down the temperature and take a certain level of tariff rate as opposed to exceedingly high tariff rates. And yet what we saw yesterday from President Macron of France and then Prime Minister Carney of Canada was essentially calling on European allies of the United States to understand, in the words of Mark Carney, that there is a rupture of the world order and that this was not a slow transition, but this was happening at an accelerated rate. It was Carney that said there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. It won't. These threats to overtake Greenland and Canada have really spurred a response from the United States, some of their closest partners and allies. And then with the president going before this crowd in Davos, this is how he responded to the Canadian Prime Minister. Take a listen.
We're building a Golden Dome that's going to, just by its very nature, going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
There was a bravado from the president of the United States there in Europe here today, in which he said the United States is keeping the whole world afloat. Not only was he saying that Canada couldn't live without the United States, he was standing there delivering the speech in Switzerland, and he referred to a conversation he said that he had last year with the female prime minister of Switzerland. We should be clear, there is no prime minister of Switzerland. There is a president of the Swiss Federation, in which he said very explicitly that talking about Switzerland, that, quote, they're only good because of us. And when he went back to World War II, he told that crowd that without us, you'd only be speaking German or a little Japanese, perhaps. The president of the United States very dismissive of the close partners and allies of the United States that have held this current global order really together, dating back to post-World War II construction.
David Rothkopf, I want to listen to another reason the president laid out for why the U.S. should essentially be given Greenland. Let's listen.
We saved Greenland and successfully prevented our enemies from gaining a foothold in our hemisphere. So we did it for ourselves also. After the war, we gave Greenland back to Denmark. How stupid were we to do that? But we did it. But we gave it back. But how ungrateful are they now?
David, if you are the Danes or Greenlandic officials, what are you thinking?
Well, I think you're angry. I don't think you see what the president is displaying here as bravado. You see it as arrogance. You see it as bullying. You see it as the behavior of an aggressor, much akin to the behavior that you've seen from Russia in Ukraine. I think today was a fiasco. I think this visit to Davos so far has been a fiasco. People walked out on Howard Lutnick last night at an event. There was great, and I've talked to people in Davos recently and just after the president's remarks, and there was real unhappiness with what they heard. They felt he was rude and ignorant and offensive. But I have to say, more important than that, this is a watershed in history. What we are watching is the breakdown of an Atlantic alliance that has been the foundation of international peace for the past 80 years. You don't get over the kind of insults he's offered to the Danes or the Canadians or the British or the French or anyone in Europe. And that's where we are. I do not think we are going to go back to the kind of Atlantic alliance that we have had, at least until Trump is gone, but possibly for a long time after that, as Europeans look with skepticism on the stability of the U.S. system that could produce an extremist who has such contempt for the international system as Donald Trump.
David Rothkopf, I mean, I keep thinking, did these remarks accomplish anything for President Trump?
No, I don't think that they did. He did not make a compelling case for the Greenland acquisition because there is no compelling case to be made. But he offended allies. He makes it more likely that they're going to stand up to him. I think he subliminally sent a message to them was that their toughness recently has got him backing off a little bit on the threat to use force. And this is Taco Trump, again, backing off when somebody stands up to him. But I think he's also sent a message that he is tone deaf, that he is oblivious to history. Woven into his remarks were other troubling dimensions. He attacked the Somalis in the most racist possible way. And they also know when they hear that this is a guy who is sending troops into the streets in the United States, that we are not the pillar of NATO that we have been for 80 years, that we are now a threat to Europe. And that's what people are walking out of the room thinking.
So, David Rohde, if you're European officials, are you reconsidering your security plans?
Yes, and you're reconsidering your political plans, because all these countries and I agree that President Trump was denigrating, Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, are democracies. And the European press coverage is already deeply negative of President Trump. It will be even more so after this kind of speech. It was insult after insult. We won World War II. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers died fighting World War II. Hundreds of thousands of French. The Canadians stormed the beaches of Normandy alongside U.S. troops. So these are political leaders who are going to have to stand up to Trump just to survive politically. And so I think this was a failure, the speech itself, and I think it's just going to turn European public opinion and therefore elected European leaders against the United States.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Donald Trump loves nothing more than to start a crisis that he could then claim credit for solving. It's a go-to move of his, and today we got the latest example of this on the world stage. Trump spoke to fellow global leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, ranting about how much he wanted to own Greenland, insulting all the European countries who've objected, going into weird tangents of gutter racism, generally embarrassing himself and all of us once again on the world stage. It's a familiar refrain now, an obsession of his. For months, he's basically been threatening to take Greenland by force the way that Hitler rolled into Czechoslovakia and Putin rolled into Ukraine. Same idea. It has brought the NATO alliance to the brink. It has spooked stock markets. It has even led Canada, yes, Canada, to formulate a military plan for dealing with a U.S. invasion. Then today, having stared the united European opposition in the face, having seen the S&P stock index lose all its gains on the year in one day, having seen poll numbers that show 86 of Americans do not want to go to war over Greenland, Donald Trump started a walk back that ended in a total retreat. It started with one line in his speech that seemed unlike all the others.
We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good. That's probably the biggest statement I made, because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force.
Okay. Again, this is Donald Trump speaking, so, should you listen to him? It was, of course, a sentiment belied by everything else he said in his speech and almost everything else his administration has said about Greenland in recent weeks. On Monday, just to cite one example, the Department of Defense was posting AI photos of American soldiers and bombers invading a snowy mountainous land. On Tuesday, when a reporter asked what lengths he would go to acquire Greenland, he said, "You'll find out." And then shortly after that speech today, Trump took to social media to announce full retreat. Quote, "Based upon a very productive meeting that I've had with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. Based upon this understanding, I will not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect on February 1st. Additional discussions are being held concerning the Golden Dome as it pertains to Greenland." I forgot about that part. "Further information will be made available as discussions progress." What does that mean? I don't know. Honestly, I think it's pretty clear Trump doesn't either.
Well, we have a concept of a deal. I think it's going to be a very good deal for the United States, also for them. And we're going to work together on something having to do with the Arctic as a whole, but also Greenland. And it has to do with the security, great security, strong security, and other things.
As Trump earlier in an interview with CNBC at Davos. So it's a concept of a framework of a future deal, and it does not sound like Trump is getting Greenland. He's getting talks about Arctic security. In return, he is not waging a trade war on Europe this time and apparently not going to invade Greenland. Now, what happened, and again, we've been through this cycle a few times, markets rallied on that news, people breathed a sigh of relief, and who could blame them? That's not how the day started, right? Trump did himself no favors today. He gave an hour-long rant in which he blasted NATO while repeatedly confusing, and this is really key, Greenland with Iceland.
Until the last few days when I told them about Iceland, they loved me. They called me daddy, right, last time. A very smart man said, he's our daddy. He's running it. I was like running it. I went from running it to being a terrible human being. But now what I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly located, that can play a vital role in world peace and world protection. I don't know that they'd be there for us. They're not there for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. I mean, our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland's already cost us a lot of money.
What are you talking about? When a reporter noted how Trump misspoke, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded to her on social media, no, he didn't. His written remarks referred to Greenland as a piece of ice because that's what it is. Leavitt included a shot of an iceberg that she apparently found when Googling Greenland. Well done. That was the culmination of a humiliating week for the U.S. in Davos. On Tuesday night, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was heckled at a World Economic Forum dinner in Davos, with European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde walking out during his speech. That dinner was reportedly called off before dessert. The Commerce Department's only response was, quote, only one person booed, and it was Al Gore, which, if true, good for him. Yesterday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave a really stirring speech in Davos about the middle powers, like Canada, of the world moving on from U.S. leadership, announcing that the rules-based order is basically dead. Multiple EU nations moved troops to Greenland in recent days, making it clear to Trump that an attack on the island would be an attack on all of Europe. And just before Trump's speech today, European lawmakers agreed to indefinitely freeze the trade agreement that Trump had struck with them last summer. In other words, Europe pushed back and called Trump's bluff. And he was isolated and humiliated, and on a dime, he backed down from only America can protect Greenland, and I need to have it psychologically because I want to feel big, to let's have great talks on Greenland. But we've been here before. Like I said at the top, this is a pattern. We saw it last year. Trump announced his arbitrary tariffs on the entire world, including uninhabited islands, remember? So-called Liberation Day. Markets tanked. People panicked. Trump met resistance, both at home and abroad. He kept delaying the date when the tariffs would kick in. He started lowering his arbitrary tax rates on individual countries, essentially negotiating with himself. And his tendency to back down under pressure on tariffs even earned him the nickname on Wall Street, Taco, as in Trump always chickens out. That was called the taco trade. What we know from experience is Trump will push as far and as hard as he can until he meets resistance. He doesn't understand consent. He will just do what he can to people until he meets some force resisting him. And it's okay, I think, to breathe a sigh of relief today. But when you zoom out, it's a toxic and dangerous cycle. I mean, Trump backed off his worst tariff threats, but not before doing huge damage to international alliances, driving up inflation, squeezing American consumers and small businesses, taking a sledgehammer to the American auto industry, pushing China to make a deal with Canada. I mean, we are worse off than when he started the tariff day crisis and then solved it. Definitely in every way. So backing off the worst case scenario isn't hardly comforting. Now we find ourselves in the same situation. Okay, we're not going to have a war of conquest in Greenland in which young American service members are shooting and killing Danes for some reason, and Danes and shooting or killing American service members so that we can steal a piece of land that is not ours. Phew. But this whole screechingly stupid affair has fundamentally altered, and some would say, I think rightly destroyed, the American-led rules-based global order that's held since World War II. The fundamental lesson here is that the crisis isn't over until Donald Trump's regime is no longer in power, because he will keep pushing every day for whatever he can get away with. And really, honestly, whatever. Be imaginative when you think about what that could be. He will do that until he's really opposed, which means you have to have unified resistance on the other side. And I think if there's one silver lining from this whole despicable mess, global leaders now understand that in a similar way that it took a while for American institutions to grasp, and some still haven't. You cannot just price in that he will back down on his own, because sometimes he does go all the way. Like after he lost the 2020 election and called it rigged, and many people who should have known better said, what's the harm in humoring him? The harm was that he tried to violently overthrow the United States government because his self-serving lies didn't meet enough resistance. If Donald Trump thinks he can get away with it, he will do it. Ask E. Jean Carroll. When he is at his most reckless, the only check on his power at home and abroad is total, constant, eternal vigilance.
Okay. In any other world, in any other news cycle, in any other administration, the president of the United States saying this on the world stage would be huge, blaring, front page, you couldn't avoid it kind of news.
Usually they say he's a horrible dictator type person. I'm a dictator. But sometimes you need a dictator.
Now, that of course, was the man who currently occupies the Oval Office saying sometimes you need a dictator and basically owning up to being one. A profoundly, doesn't matter how many times he says it, disturbing sentiment from the man who's supposed to be leading the world's most powerful democracy. So why didn't that statement dominate all the headlines today? We hear her talking about it, but why didn't it dominate the headlines? Well, in part because we already know he sees himself as a dictator based on his tyrannical approach to governing, and also because on the same day at the World Economic Forum in Davos, when he proudly owned up to being a dictator, his shocking disconnection from reality was also on full display in the speech. I mean, today before an audience of world leaders, Trump rambled for over an hour, railing against our allies, including the host nation of Switzerland, insulting Joe Biden, lamenting that windmills are losers, and also reiterating his plans to take over Greenland. Of course, Trump has been obsessed with the idea of the U.S. taking control of Greenland for nearly a decade. The man has been fixated on it since his first term. I mean, Donald Trump has given more thought to annexing Greenland, I think it's safe to say, than he has given to most geopolitical issues, which is why it was so remarkable when today Donald Trump could not seem to remember exactly which territory he has long been completely obsessed with annexing.
I'm helping NATO, and I've until the last few days when I told them about Iceland, they loved me. They called me daddy, right, last time. A very smart man said, he's our daddy. He's running it. I was like running it. I went from running it to being a terrible human being. But now what I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly located, that can play a vital role in world peace and world protection.
Hey, Daddy, I have a question for you. Why are we talking about Iceland all of a sudden? I mean, I thought the territory that you wanted to take over is Greenland, not Iceland. You can see them on the map there, two different countries. But hey, we all make mistakes from time to time, a slip of the tongue. I mean, it's not like you repeated that mistake over and over and over again in front of the entire world, right?
So with all of the money we expend, with all of the blood, sweat, and tears, I don't know that they'd be there for us. They're not there for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. I mean, our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland's already cost us a lot of money. But that dip is peanuts compared to what it's gone up.
That's not over and over again. Trump referred to the territory he wanted to take over as Iceland in front of a bunch of world leaders, which, again, is an entirely different country and entirely different island, which means there is now an entirely different population sitting around wondering if the American president is going to try and annex their home because he can't remember what word comes before land on the map of allied nations he wants to claim for himself. But hey, I mean, maybe Trump is just feeling sleepy again. We know that happens. Probably just tired from his long trip to Switzerland. I bet if we went back and listened to his nearly 2-hour tour de force in the White House briefing room yesterday, you'd find a much more cogent version of what he is trying to say.
as an example, Iceland, without tariffs, they wouldn't even be talking to us.
Iceland again. I mean, Donald Trump literally cannot remember which country he has long wanted to invade. Remember, this is the guy who claims he is going to start a new Donroe Doctrine. I mean, I don't even know how to say that. I don't want to know how to say that. Of U.S. control over the entire western half of the globe. What is he going to do when he finds out there's a Uruguay and a Paraguay? What is he going to do? Now, given the international crisis that's Trump's Greenland's ambitions have set off, his repeated flub obviously caused the attention of reporters in the room. And News Nation's Libby Dean posted this from the event. Quote, during his World Economic Forum remarks, President Trump appeared to mix up Greenland and Iceland around 3 times. Look, I just showed you them. You just saw them on your screen. That's a very straightforward description of what we all witnessed with our own eyes, what we all heard with our own ears. But since this administration will not abide by any reporting that doesn't sound like a North Korean state media broadcast, Trump's press secretary immediately fired back, quote, no, he didn't, Libby. His written remarks referred to Greenland as a piece of ice because that's what it is. You're the only one mixing anything up here. Okay, as a sidebar, your written remarks have nothing to do with what you say repeatedly, publicly out of your mouth of the President of the United States, so that doesn't address it. But that's what that is. That's what the press secretary said. So I realize that the American right has just spent the last few weeks trying to convince us that what we see on videotape is not actually the God's honest truth, what we see with our own eyes. But this is really kind of another level of reality denial here. I mean, there's no special camera angle or selective edit or spin that can make you believe this is anything other than what it was. The President of the United States saying the word Iceland over and over again.
When I told them about Iceland, they loved me. They're not there for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. I mean, our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland's already cost us a lot of money.
Iceland is not Greenland. Greenland is not Iceland. You don't have to be an expert in foreign policy to know that. Anyone who's ever glanced at a map could tell you that. I mean, anyone who may have watched Mighty Ducks 2 could also tell you that.
Wait a minute, I thought Iceland was covered with ice.
Iceland? No, it's very green.
I thought Greenland was green.
Greenland is covered with ice, and Iceland is very nice.
Listen, anyone out there who knows anyone in the White House, if you're trying to help him get it straight, that video is available. You can find it, and maybe it's in his terms. But that's really where we are, everyone. I mean, a kid's movie from the 90s is literally operating at a higher level of geographical understanding than the President of the United States right now. And God love him, there are still too many people in the American press who are trying to analyze all of this through some serious foreign policy lens, where words are chosen with intention and delicate diplomatic meaning. I mean, today, during that same event, Donald Trump also said this about his plans for Greenland.
We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good.
Now, let's hope that's the case. And certainly that's what we should all hope for. Immediately after Trump made those comments, news organizations everywhere started running with headlines like this. Trump rules out using military force to acquire Greenland in Davos speech. Trump says he will not use force to acquire Greenland. Trump rules out using force to acquire Greenland. Now, let's hope, again, that's the case. But Trump literally started that sentence with, we probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. That phrase, that sounds to me a little bit more like a mob boss telling you he doesn't want to have to break your legs, but he will if he needs to, than a president completely ruling out military action. Needless to say, none of this is reasoned, well thought out diplomacy, but some people still insist on acting like it all is. Remember that it was just 4 days ago that Trump threatened to slap steep tariffs on 8 European countries because the continent had refused to recognize his ridiculous claim to Greenland. That sent the stock market crashing as investors grappled with the idea that Trump was planning to effectively punish people in his own country by raising prices in order to pressure the rest of the world to give him part of another country. But Trump loves almost nothing more than creating a fake crisis in order to swoop in and behave like he is solving the crisis that he created. And so today, after his long, winding speech, the president took to social media to announce that he had met with the leader of NATO and, quote, formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland, and that he would, quote, not be imposing the tariffs. And if we needed any more proof that this was all some sort of BS face-saving effort, just listen to the way Trump described his so-called deal in an interview with CNBC just moments later.
Well, we have a concept of a deal. It looks like we have pretty much a concept of a deal.
A deal of ownership, a deal...
Well, it's a little bit complex, but we'll explain it down the line.
A little complex. We'll explain it down the line. That's not guy's out policy wonk. And yet his complete lack of detail for a fake plan designed to solve a crisis he created did not stop some Fox commentators from treating him like a conquering hero, historic national security figure.
It's really hard not to see this through the lens of the art of the deal.
A lot of this is classic Donald Trump negotiating status. He goes in, the bull in the china shop. People think he's going to use force. Then when he takes force off the table, they're all like, phew.
Love him or hate him, when he leaves that room, everybody there felt like America First threw up all over them.
I mean, I can't argue that last point, I suppose. But unfortunately for the Fox News crowd, things got a little awkward when the very NATO leader Trump claims to have inked this deal with went on the very same network to tell the very same viewers what is really in this deal.
What I don't hear is Greenland is it still under the Kingdom of Denmark in this framework deal?
That issue did not come up anymore in my conversations tonight with the president.
Didn't come up. Trump did not mention Greenland, I guess. It sounds like while negotiating his supposed Greenland deal. Did he forget about the reason he caused this diplomatic crisis in the first place? Did he accidentally make a deal to acquire Iceland? Or can we all accept the obvious truth that Trump once again chickened out and walked it all back? I mean, and I'm fine with that in this case, in most cases of things he's out there blasting around he's going to do. See, all Trump has managed to do with his ridiculous Greenland obsession is further destroy America's relationships with some of our closest allies. And if left to it's left to serious lawmakers to try and pick up the pieces.
The Trump administration has started arresting immigrants in Maine as part of a new federal operation targeting the state. That operation is focusing mostly on immigrants from Somalia. That's according to the New York Times. MS Now's Antonia Hilton has exclusive reporting on the increasingly aggressive tactics immigration agents are using. Specifically, an encounter involving an undocumented father taking his son to school when masked men in unmarked cars approached them. The family says the agents never identified themselves as law enforcement, so they decided to flee.
We didn't know what was happening, but they were still chasing us, and that's when they started hitting our car, trying to flip us.
Le voy a pegar al lado. No, esto ya es muy feo. Esto ya es muy feo. Esto ya es muy feo. La mira.
That chase that you just watched there ended with agents violently detaining both father and son and sending the son, a U.S. citizen, to the hospital. The Department of Homeland Security has denied allegations that agents assaulted them. We've had a conversation for a long time about how public service should have a face. Public service should also identify itself as such.
I really think people need to watch Antonia's documentary that she did on this. It's a MS Now exclusive. It's up on YouTube right now. But what I appreciate about this, and I think why it's very important, is that the documentary makes a case that Andrea Flores made on our show just at the top of this week, that a lot of people just talk about ICE. There's a lot of focus on ICE because they got the infusion of money, the $170 billion plus from the One Big Beautiful Bill. They are the ones that have kind of become the face of this operation. But the reality is that the Customs and Border Patrol, which usually operate only within 100 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, they have now they've infiltrated ICE. They have taken a lot of these CBP officials, put them in as ICE officers, and they are now adopting the ICE tactics. And Antonia's documentary makes that case very, very clear. And so the ramming of the cars, they're trying to flip the car over, that's something you do when you're dealing with the cartel.
You have the DHS Secretary spokesperson, Tricia McLaughlin, who...
I'm sorry, I sighed because Tricia often lies.
And that's why I want to fact check this in real time, which is she said that the father that you saw there has a conviction for a DUI. MS Now found out that was a decades-old misdemeanor.
Of course it was. Of course it was. And the thing about all of this, America, is that all of this is happening. The videos we're seeing, the stories are being told, the impact it's having on families, it's all happening in your name. It's all happening in our name as U.S. citizens because our government is doing this to its own people. There are ways to deal with immigrants who are here without papers. There are ways to deal with immigrants who are here who've overstayed their visas. There are ways to deal with immigrant populations, many of whom are still learning the language, learning the American system. But we don't want to take the time. Our elected officials don't want to take the time. 2006, we squashed any immigration reform, right? A few years later, the Gang of Eight killed the effort that they made was killed by conservatives because, oh no, we don't want to solve the problem of immigration. The 2020 election, the 2016 election, the 2024 election, again, immigration is the issue everyone's talking about. Everybody knows we have a problem. But the elected individuals in the House and the Senate, on the Republican side especially, because they're the ones been killing the bills, don't want to solve the problem because there's so much political advantageous activity that comes from it. The fundraising, the demonizing, the histrionics, the loud noise, the gang splaying, right? Where you're talking about everybody's a member of a gang. It's happening in our name.
It's happening in our name, and right now what you have is the dad that we were just watching. He chose to self-deport. He hasn't seen his son, a U.S. citizen, since last October.
But the reason he chose to self-deport, according to Antonia's reporting in this documentary, is because they told the father, they as in the federal agents, the Customs and Border Patrol or ICE, told him that they would arrest his son if he did not sign the papers. And so the tactics are insane.
That's
coercion.
Coercion.
Connect this with what Alicia said, though, at the top of this about how now ICE, CBP, federal agents are now in Maine focused on Somalians. And to be very clear, the Trump administration ended temporary protective status for Somalians in the U.S. this month. They did so. It was just a couple days ago. It is as of mid-March, folks will no longer be protected.
They have made people undocumented.
They have made them undocumented. This is the government playing with people's status, and they said, "Oh, it's become safer in Somalia." I will note the UN begs to differ.
It begs to differ on that.
MS Now's legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher just got out of the courthouse. Also with me, former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman, also a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President Clinton and host of the Talking Feds podcast. In studio with me, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin and veteran financial journalist Ron Insana. Ron also publishes the Message of the Markets on Substack. Fallon, I can't even imagine what it was like to be in the courtroom. It wasn't just Jerome Powell who was there. Former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke was there as well, which surely underscores the stakes here. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, Chris, this argument today felt different than any of the other cases that I've been in this term. This is a Supreme Court that appears highly likely to side with Lisa Cook in this case. They expressed deep skepticism that the president has the authority to fire here and that the for cause, which is what the statute requires, was met. They repeatedly went through the process of this firing, that she was fired by Truth Social, which got a number of laughs in the courtroom, and that she was not entitled to any sort of a hearing. There's also documentation that came through the lower courts that showed that this alleged mortgage fraud was probably not even actually a reality, that there's paperwork that indicates that she insinuated that this was a vacation home. But the preliminary nature of this entire case was really on display during these arguments. Remember that this is a case that came to the Supreme Court through the emergency docket based off of a preliminary injunction. There is no final judgment that the Supreme Court justices are even ruling on here. The justices expressed frustration on a a number of occasions about why this needed to be rushed so quickly, that they don't even have the facts of the case. At one point, Justice Alito asked whether those mortgage papers were even introduced as evidence in the case in the lower courts, that there is no factual basis here that they can even dissect. But Justice Brett Kavanaugh had a very sharp line of questioning for Sauer, the Solicitor General, saying that this case could open a can of worms that could create a dangerous precedent moving forward. He reminded them that what goes around comes around, and that when it does come around, it comes around even stronger. And so if they were to change this precedent here and start treating the Fed differently and give the president this power to fire the Fed, a Fed governor at will like this, then that could create a dangerous precedent for presidents moving forward. Chris?
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. I know you listened to the arguments as well. What stood out to you?
I think what stood out to me was how breathtaking John Sauer, who is the Solicitor General's conception of presidential power is. So let's first start with the proposition that the administration is not challenging the constitutionality of the statute that governs Fed removal here. Everybody agrees that the standard is for cause. But essentially what John Sauer said was that's unreviewable by even the Supreme Court. They don't get to determine what cause means. And when the president decides that cause has been established, they don't get to second guess that at all, which prompted a bunch of incredulous responses from the justices. Like, what are we even doing here if we don't have the right to forge a remedy or even review the president's actions? You're basically telling me that the standard that exists, that he can only do this for cause, not for policy disagreements, is essentially illusory. It's ephemeral. If we can't review it, then he can really do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And Sauer didn't have an effective answer for that, Chris.
So, Harry, multiple justices did press Sauer on the question of why it's okay that Cook be removed from her position without being given a chance to even dispute the allegations against her. Here's what Justice Alito had to say about that.
Is there any reason why this whole matter had to be handled by everybody, by the executive branch, by the district court, by the D.C. Circuit in such a hurried manner? You began by laying out what you claim to be the factual basis for the for-cause removal, but no court has ever explored those facts. Are the mortgage applications even in the record in this case?
I know that the text of the social media post that screenshots to the mortgage applications is in the record, but I don't recall if the paperwork itself is in the record.
Screenshots of a social media post. Harry, your assessment.
Yeah, so the unhurried or the hurried manner that Alito's talking about means this is an emergency application where the court, where the administration is screaming, we're having irreparable injury. That and the point that Lisa made that they're not trying to say that the for-cause provision is unconstitutional. Those are the critical sort of bedrock procedural facts. What comes out of that then in a messy and underdeveloped case that the justices were in fact frustrated over is how they will send it back. I think it's true that Cook is likely to win, but they were casting about for how, with the two candidates being first, some definition of for cause that says it wasn't met here, or second, some procedural infirmity that says send it back to the D.C. Circuit to try to patch up that infirmity, with the cost being that the court has to decide the issue on the substance later. Final big point is what you had about Kavanaugh at the top. He was tiptoeing to the sort of point that is hovering here, but no one wants to say politely, which is when Trump proffered this supposed mortgage application before Cook was even on the Fed, what was really happening was a policy difference. It was a pretext, and the way they could decide it might green light that. So it's a big fact that everyone understands, even though the court in its tradition won't call out the president for that obvious pretext.
I have to say, Lisa, when we were talking earlier this morning, one of the things you said is this is one of the more straightforward ones. These are all things that you don't have to have a legal degree to understand, like where's the mortgage applications, where's the basis for this. But I want to play some of what we heard from Cook's attorney, Paul Clement, because he was asked what he thinks the president should have done to deal with Lisa Cook.
The president has to make the decision, right?
or delegate it to somebody who he wishes to make that decision, who's reportable to him.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
At will.
At will. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, and the president can be the final decision maker, but if he's going to be the final decision maker, and there's a due process right, and I mean that statutory or constitutional, then he needs to be a little bit careful and say these are the allegations. He can't start by prejudging the issue by saying resign.
What else can you tell us about how Clement made his case?
Very deftly, because one of the things Clement did was pivot when the justices put an obstacle in his way. So one of the things he said was, maybe the definition of, and I'm putting words into his mouth, maybe the definition of cause isn't what we have said in our legal briefs. And what they've said is it has to be at least inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance while in office. But if it's something different than that, for example, Justice Alito raised the example of somebody who's committed sexual misconduct before office. If it's more than that, then the president has another remedy. You can always ask Congress to impeach a member of the Fed Reserve Board of Governors. So Paul Clement, extraordinarily deft, a masterclass in oral argument today. But Chris, one of the other things that I thought was really interesting was him just basically saying, let's see this for what it is. Lisa Cook was appointed to a 14-year term on the Fed Reserve Board of Governors. Even if you disagree that she had a property interest in her job akin to tenure, you have to do something more than make a Truth Social post to remove somebody for cause. That's common sense. And that goes back to the conversation you and I had this morning. This is not an intricate statute that we're unraveling at Supreme Court argument. This is something that makes sense to ordinary people. It can't just be, I am removing you for cause because I hate you, right? That's not what's going on here.
Oh, if only in some cases that were true. But fortunately, it's not. Look, we said at the beginning, Ron, that yes, and this is what we've been talking about, the limits or lack thereof of presidential power. But it's also about the economy. And tell us why people should care about this.
Well, for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which is the Federal Reserve, as we all know, sets interest rates, which determine the cost of money. And that extends from everything from your mortgage to other costs that you're going to bear buying a car over time, how the economy functions. What it also deals with and points to is whether or not the president then also has the authority, if he were to lose this case, to remove the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, whom he has criticized publicly for not lowering interest rates to his desired level. If you get to a point, and it doesn't appear that it's going this way, but had the Supreme Court judges in the future decided that the president has this power to remove Lisa Cook and then Jay Powell, he could pack the Fed with people who would do his bidding based on political considerations as opposed to economic considerations. And you get, historically, when you look at other central banks that have been politicized, bad economic outcomes, whether it's inflation that's in excess of what it should be, whether a currency collapses, whether you have an adverse economic outcome. Even Brett Kavanaugh admitted that this is what's at stake. Are you threatening the independence of the Federal Reserve by doing this? And as a consequence, will this lead to outcomes that are unfavorable for the population at large, if you're going to read into what he had to say? And that is the real risk. If you have a Fed that's not independent, we've seen this time and time again, the economic outcomes are truly, in some cases, devastating, depending on where you look.